Welcome to Waterside Chat. Tom Sadler talks with guests who depend on healthy oceans and fisheries for their recreation and livelihoods. And now, let's get started.
Okay, well, good afternoon and welcome to today's Waterside Chat. For the next few months, we will be chatting with our network members, both new and old, to hear from them about their stories with the Magnuson Stevens Act and what the network means to them. The Magnuson Stevens Act is celebrating 50 years in existence this year, and the network is now in its 33rd year. So, marking some milestones here at the Marine Fish Conservation Network. My guest today is Molly Masterton. Molly is a harried environmental lawyer from the Natural Resources Defense Council and co-chair of our National Policy Council. Today, we'll be learning about Molly and her experience with the Marine Fish Conservation Network and what the Magnuson Stevens Act means to her. Welcome, Molly.
Thank you, Tom. Great to be with you.
Well,
thanks for the very honest descriptor there.
We were in the green room and you mentioned
brutally honest.
A harried environmental lawyer, and I thought that is about as good a description as the work you do. I don't know that I even know your official title, but harried environmental lawyer seems to fit you just right.
Yep. I've been doing it long enough to be a senior attorney now. So maybe, senior and more harried than I was when
a senior
when I first started.
Harried environmental lawyer.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, Molly, let's talk a little bit about Molly Masterton. Where'd you grow up? Where were you born? Where'd you grow up? Where'd you go to school? Kind of give me some early background on Molly.
Yeah, so I grew up in Maine, the woods and waters of Maine, just sort of running around and playing with sticks and getting a lot of time in nature. And, most of my decisions and what I've done since being young, growing up there has been pretty heavily informed by my time in nature and just sort of being really curious about wildlife and about the natural world. I wanted to go into conservation from a young age, and I was kind of interested in wildlife biology, coastal marine biology, and ended up in a great place to be able to work on those issues. I was at Bowdoin College up in Maine, and sort of ended up taking kind of like an environmental science and policy route in college. And then after a brief stint as an environmental educator working with young kids, I decided to go to law school, sort of when one of those kind of knew I wanted to work on conservation, was really interested in wildlife conservation in particular. And I didn't know much about it, but I thought I'd read enough about the law as kind of both a shield and a sword for protecting wildlife and our resources. And I wanted to learn more about how to be able to use those tools. Didn't exactly know where it would go, but that is how I landed in my role now, working on one of the arguably the most interesting wildlife systems in the world on fisheries. And then just one funny thing, because it relates to the network, I took a course in undergrad on, it was like macroeconomics / natural resources economics. And the professor had the foresight to, in addition to, he was kind of an expert in fisheries and other natural resources issues, but he had the foresight to assign Carl Safina's Song for the Blue Ocean as required reading for all of his economics.
How about that?
I know. And I never heard of Carl, but just was so struck by, it's at once a very heartbreaking, but also really captivating and optimistic tale of how fisheries management challenges can bring folks from different sectors together and work to find solutions together. So that was like an early pull for me to be like, oh, this is a really interesting set of issues to work on. Yeah. And of course, Carl is one of the founders of the Marine Fish Conservation Network.
That's I love the way that tied back in.
Yeah.
Whereabouts in Maine, just out of curiosity, were you born?
Just
Raised?
outside of Portland, if
Uh-huh.
you've been.
Oh yeah, no,
Yeah.
I spent most of my misguided youthful summers prior to high school in northern Maine up on Moosehead Lake.
Oh, so beautiful. Yeah. Yeah. It's farm country pretty shortly once you get
Hmm.
northwest out of the big city in Portland. But just a really great community there. And even if I didn't come from a fishing family, but we certainly knew lobster families, and
Sure.
everybody had some pots in the backyard, whether they were legal or not. Uh, yeah. So super interesting. And yeah, it's just funny to think. I knew I wanted to work on wildlife, but fisheries kind of more found me when I was on the job hunt after law school.
Well, Bowdoin's a remarkable school. It's just one of the schools that I applied to, Bowdoin and Colby,
Oh,
um,
sure.
that I did not make the cut because I was a ne'er-do-well in high school. Um, Lucky to even be allowed into the university system in New Hampshire. So, but I had two very close friends who were at Bowdoin, and I have a very fond memories of that area. Um,
Yeah,
so,
it's a
which
great
we
place.
won't go into
Yeah, they're
here.
all good.
Yeah, they're all
We
good.
could, we could go
Um,
on.
and so how did you wind up at NRDC?
Yeah, so they were I was a few years or a couple years really out of law school. I was pretty green, but was looking for some kind of long-term position, um, doing a lot of focus on like wildlife and even like animal protection type roles. Um, and NRDC happened to be looking for someone to help cover the fisheries portfolio. It was only 10 years ago, which kind of
Really?
a blip in the scheme of things, right? But if you recall, we were kind of in the middle, we were kind of in the fray of Magnuson reauthorization discussions 10 years ago. There was interest in Congress in kind of
Hmm.
reviving the act. There were also some really bad proposals out there that would have rolled back some of our conservation standards that we'll talk about. So they needed someone to kind of like step in and help take over that work for NRDC, which it's a team I'm proud to be a part of because they've been working on fisheries issues for decades.
Right.
Both some of the early amendments of the act, and then also for the last 15, 20 years, we've worked more internationally as well. We have fisheries work in China. Um, we have work around combating global illegal fishing, and then a whole group of colleagues working on protection of the high seas, which culminated in a historic international treaty for protection of the high seas recently. So it's a
Hmm.
team working on a lot of things, and a bunch of other oceans issues as well. The U.S. fisheries work portfolio is a bit smaller, and I kind of had to come in and kind of help move it forward. And I've honestly, like every single day, I've learned something new since coming on the job. Um, yeah, I knew enough to be kind of dangerous, right? And was willing to stay up all hours to work on legal briefs and legislative language and all that. But really, the connections that I've made through coalitions, through groups like the network, and kind of learning about the different perspectives on fisheries has been it's just I can't think of a more fascinating set of issues.
Excellent. Well, you and I share a similar timeline. I joined the network 10 years ago. So,
Oh,
um,
that's right.
and I
Yeah,
feel similar to you. It's been a fascinating, but it's gone fast, hasn't it? 10 years
it
has gone
has.
by fast.
Yeah, I think really being in the thick of the legislative work for the first maybe half of that,
Yeah.
um, that certainly flew by, and then since then I've been working a little more increasingly on a mix of domestic and international issues, and there's so much work to be done. Yeah,
Yeah.
it has flown by.
So, one of the things I want to do is there's a be policy guys, wonks like us get together and we assume everybody knows what we're talking about. But if Molly had tagline, short explanation of what the Magnuson Stevens Act is, what would that be?
Yeah. So it's our primary fisheries law, the Magnuson Stevens Act, Fisheries Conservation and Management Act. Conservation is in the title, but I would argue that it's really much more of a natural resources management perspective that begot the law and has kind of informed its implementation since. But it's thanks to Magnuson, we have the fishery management councils across 8 regions that really are this fairly unique model of giving various folks who have the closest stake in the outcome of management. So commercial fishers, recreational fishers, tribal subsistence perspectives in some cases, giving those folks the sort of the first and most direct say in management decisions. That's a really unique thing. So we have the councils.
Yeah.
Of course, they rely on NOAA Fisheries, the federal agency, for robust science and for partnership and support. And NOAA ultimately signs off on the council's actions, but the councils are kind of the first movers, and it all starts with them. And then since I guess the 70s that's sort of when we had a spate of various conservation statutes that came about. But Magnuson initially was more about the incursion of foreign fisheries in our exclusive economic zone and kind of wanting to define the bounds of U.S. fisheries and U.S. federal waters. But it did, the original statute, 1976, did point to this standard of this central goal, National Standard 1, which is to prevent overfishing while achieving optimal yield in all of our managed fisheries. And it's a complicated balancing act, right? And I don't know if you want to talk more about this, but it took kind of successive amendments to the statute to really make that, especially the preventing overfishing part, to make that workable and have there be standards in place whereby we have science-based tools to actually prevent overfishing. And then if a stock becomes depleted and can't replenish itself on its own, there's a standard in the Magnuson Stevens Act that councils have to work to rebuild those stocks in as short a time as possible, with some exceptions. And that's one that NRDC worked a bunch on through legal advocacy, primarily before I came to NRDC, but that work continues still today because there's still a number of stocks that need to be rebuilt.
To me, that what you just described is really the essential elements of the conservation part. As you said, the early part was, let's kick these guys out of our water. And it was really so we could fish. Somewhere along the line, the act became known for its conservation elements, which said you can't take all the fish out of the system or you're not going to be able to do anything. That's the conservation side of it. And then, I believe it was 2006, that reauthorization, where they actually put enforcement teeth into it. And do you think that is right, that that's where the enforcement became important to underpin or to reinforce or protect the conservation elements of the Magnuson Act?
Yeah, I would agree with that for sure. 1996 had a number of notable sort of broadly agreed upon reforms, including that rebuilding requirement that I mentioned. That sort of preceded the annual catch limit requirement. But what was interesting about that, and each region has its own really unique story, but in regions like Alaska, where they already had a system in place of having science-based catch limits and then accountability to those limits, which means if a fishery in a particular season goes over its quota, there would be some kind of payback or a management change to actually correct the reasons for the overages, and that way you're actually accountable to the limit, right?
Mm-hmm.
Other regions like New England still were using what we would call like a soft cap without accountability to the limit, and kind of focusing on input controls, which are important, like days at sea and gear restrictions, but not really thinking about the overall poundage of fish that can come out. And then if you exceed that, correcting it like a math problem. The regions that weren't operating that way still had massive chronic overfishing problems. So in the years leading up to the 2006 reauthorization that you mentioned, it's pretty stark the extent to which the members of Congress and the senators that worked on that legislation, they were really clear, like, we want annual catch limits to be a real limit on catch. It should be apparent from that term, right? But it's a limit on all catch, including kind of unintended bycatch in a fishery, which is still a big issue. And it's managers are going to have to hold the fishery accountable to that limit, and that's this additional language in the statute that's around application of accountability measures. And they were really clear that that's what this means, and it's intended to sort of make that the seminal language in the statute, preventing overfishing, make that kind of come to fruition. And I feel like it's had its intended impact in a lot of ways. I think whereas in 2006 we had like 50 stocks subject to overfishing, still that number was cut in half through ACLs, and so overfishing is at an all-time low. We still do have stocks that are struggling to recover from that overfished or depleted condition, including some of the sort of struggling stocks in New England and in other regions, and stocks that are struggling with unmanaged and unmonitored bycatch. That's another big one. But I would say it's had its intended effect. But as always, there's a lot of work to be done.
For sure.
And one example of that is we've been working on a draft paper that kind of looks at implementation of catch limits and accountability across all the regions since that '06 requirement. And we found that in a fifth of all stock years between 2010 and 2020, so upwards of 20%, there are overages. Overages of ACLs do happen pretty frequently. The science isn't perfect, the catch accounting isn't perfect, but even for stocks that are overfished, where NOAA's own guidelines say that they should be accountable to that limit and put a payback in place, that's often not happening. So I think there are still a lot of questions about the extent to which ACLs and accountability are being adhered to. There's a lot of discussion about how to best apply ACLs to the recreational sector, which has grown substantially in the last 10 years in terms of its effort at the waters. So we still have problems to solve to kind of, the goal is not like kind of try to prevent overfishing and you have some wiggle room and maybe you can fix it 10 years later. The goal is prevent overfishing, right? So I feel like there's definitely more discussions to be had.
Yeah, and I mean that's the future in front of us. As opposed to the future behind us, Tom. But okay.
Oh, and not just, I mean, one more thought is, I think some of those stocks that are struggling to rebuild in New England, in the Gulf, in the South Atlantic, after sort of repeated rebuilding plans, those are some of the same ones that have those repeat overages. So I definitely think more investigations needed to determine the way that we're treating those struggling stocks.
Yes, and hopefully we're going to get there. So I want to try to connect a little bit of a dot here in something you said. You came to this work through an interest in conservation, natural resources conservation, and many of the times we think about that as shovels and boots on the ground and stuff like that. But so I'm going to try to get your reaction to a statement I would make here, is that then in a lot of cases, what you've just described that needs to be done isn't done with a shovel. If there's if there are boots on the ground, they're on a ground in Washington, D.C., or in some cases, the councils. But they're not, this is not getting your hands dirty with soil. It's getting your hands dirty in another aspect. But if you came to NRDC and you were a lawyer, okay, not what most people would see as typically in mind a conservationist, right? Doing the dirt, throwing dirt, squeezing fish, science stuff. I would argue that when we talk about conservationists, when we talk about conservation, that the work that NRDCs use specifically, and I'm going to come to the network, but the people who are part of the National Policy Council, they're as much conservationist as someone who's planting trees, turning soil, rolling rocks, what have you, getting their hands dirty in the soil or in the water, get their boots wet. How do you react to that? Is that a fair assessment of the work that we do?
Yeah, I think we know that we all share, especially, in a group like the Marine Conservation Network, we know that we all share this goal of wanting to conserve the resource for its ecological value, for its value to communities, including fishing communities, of course, and for future generations, right? But we all come to it from different perspectives. Maybe our shovel is a different tool depending on what our training and our background is. Yeah. But I think, it reminds me in the fishery space in particular, when you come in, as I did, as sort of like a younger professional, and I'm not based in DC, I will say I'm up in New York. I don't know if that's any better, but, like you have to you go into council meetings, you're certainly going to be speaking to fishermen and folks that have a vested interest in the fishing industry, and the immediate criticism a lot of ENGO sort of ivory tower, you might say, type folks is that we're not spending enough time on the docks. We're not seeing the impacts of decisions on the water the same way that maybe different representatives, or certainly the fishers themselves, are. And I think that's very true. There's a huge value to actually going out and meeting with communities where they are. They're the ones that are the most impacted by these decisions. So we do try to do that work. But I also think, just as a matter of the way these systems play out, it is important to have rules at that national level. Conservation standards, kind of the baseline, and that's what legislation's for. So folks that are spending time working on that, I think that's an important value. So yeah, I mean, I think conservationists that work at that legislative level or on legal advocacy to sort of hold government to the standards that it's set for themselves, that's a big part of what we do at NRDC as well. I definitely think it's conservation work. Something I'd much rather be out on the water sometimes. So it's always nice when work, being at a council meeting or something allows that to be the case.
Sure.
But yeah, we need both sides, right?
Business if we didn't want to be outside, if we didn't have a heritage or a legacy of that being outside.
100%.
But it is, the reason why I look to you or others on the policy council is that you have invested significant resources, personal, professional resources, in being a guardian of the Magnuson Act, but also a champion for its purpose. right? And its purpose, as you said at the top, it was conservation. But that conservation is not necessarily putting woody debris in streams or rolling rocks or creating habitat, right? It's all of which are important, but the work that the lawyers and the lobbyists and the advocates do are what make that possible. And it is being in a position to help the elected officials, the appointed officials, understand the ramifications, I think is significant conservation work. Would you agree?
Yeah, absolutely. And another thing that I'm not, I wouldn't call myself is a scientist. I'm not a trained scientist, but fisheries management, as you know, is a really data and science hungry process. So we need, like, I would, until the day I die, I'd defend the systems and rules that are in place to make sure that scientists are sort of integrated into the decision making process, providing advice to the councils and actually having that advice followed when it comes to catch limits, and then just support. This is something that we have a lot of alignment on with the fishing community, is support for robust assessments and surveys and modeling, all the updates that are happening and need to happen to respond to climate change. Makes it even more data hungry, and we the lawyers have a role to play in kind of defending those values and that science-based and stakeholder-based decision-making process as well. So yeah, I think all those different perspectives talking to each other, really, yeah, that's all conservation work. I would agree.
I want to celebrate the work that you do.
Thank you.
It's so critically important. I mean, I didn't start out being a lobbyist, but I wound up being one for 40 plus years. It's, I would much prefer to be getting my feet wet in a mountain stream, looking to protect my beloved brook trout. But I also look and say, hey, the people who are pounding the halls on Capitol Hill, the people who are understanding the legal ramifications of when policy is being discussed, that's critically important to allow us to be able to do the work that we do, which I would say, and where I'm going here is I'm broadening the definition of conservation from what some people would say. If you're not rolling rocks or planting trees or moving dirt, yeah, you're in your ivory tower in Washington, D.C. And maybe I'm sensitive now because it's been 40 years of doing this. It's like, hey, our job is important too. And when someone as accomplished and qualified as you are I have an opportunity to chat with, I want to shine that light on you. And thank you.
Well, it's appreciated. Yeah. And the network is, we're always reminded and grateful for the fact that the commercial fishers, folks that have been worked on the council before or been working with the council for decades, the recreational guides, scientists, all those folks are conservationists as well, right? We all share that same goal. So
yeah, I mean, in my time in the fly fishing industry, when it was one of our mantras was give me a fly, let me teach a fly fisherman and I will turn them into a conservationist. I think the work that has been done by your organization and colleagues, other colleague organizations reaching out to the small boat commercial fishing community to reinforce their instincts. These guys don't go out there to go broke. They go out there to catch fish and make a living. And so to the degree that we can support the good actors this is the same thing in the fly fishing industry. We want to support the good actors. And again, someone has to explain to them why catch limits are important or how they work. But they want to stay in the business. And so I think I'm monologuing here and I should let you. How do you feel like the network does in terms of bringing those diverse voices together?
Yeah, I mean, I think you touched on it there, which is being, I think we're resources to each other. Is one really important thing. We realize, everyone, I don't necessarily love being like the most chatty person in the room or, the one on the soapbox, but I will if I have to be. And I also I prefer to listen and learn from people who are teaching me. Tell me what I didn't know, because I'm already pretty steadfast in the things that I think should happen. And that is what the network's about. So those of us who are kind of day in, day out tracking the sort of absolute deluge of policy proposals that come out. Look, NRDC is pretty focused on watchdogging those core conservation requirements that we talked about. We're also pretty focused on, what's going on with marine habitat protection, both under Magnuson and other standards. So I love being a resource to somebody who spends more of their days out on the water than at their desk, and sort of sharing what's up, what's relevant to them, and figuring out how we can be aligned on our response to help move things in the right direction for conservation. Similarly, as there's folks in the network from regions across the country. We've got New England representation, Alaska, the Gulf. So kind of sharing timely updates and just expertise, really robust expertise about what's going on in their respective regions. I think that's really important. And I'm just really in large part thanks to yours and others' efforts to keep us all coordinated and rowing in the same direction. I'm always really pleased when we're able to put together a timely proposal or a response to a proposal that's in the policy space that's really representative of this broad cross section of perspectives. And I think, let's see if I wrote this down. I read Ken Hinman's blog about the MSA 50th and the network's role in the early days of Magnuson, how important that is. See if I can find. There was this great quote that I was like, oh, I could not have said that better. See if I can find it.
He did a remarkable job, didn't he?
So Ken's blog summarizing the network, he talked about the 1996 amendments and how those could only come about through kind of cooperation among a wide group of stakeholders, in particular those who care the most about the ocean, whether it's to fish, to sail, to dive, to explore, or simply to enjoy. The network remains a place where individual and organizational egos are left at the door, and where we say we when referring to our shared goals and accomplishments. So I thought, who could say it better than one of the founders of the network? And I think that's really still true today, which is that it's a team effort, and we're kind of interested in finding that cross section of things that we agree on. Folks who care the most about the ocean.
I think you're absolutely right. Ken nailed it. And yeah. Do you think it's still as relevant today and in fact as important, if not more so today, to have a coalition group like the network at the table doing the work that the network has done for 33 years, looking forward?
Yeah, I mean, I no surprise probably to hear we're always hearing about how divided we are as a nation, right? Of course, when it comes to politics, when it comes to a lot of things. I think it seems like that may seem true at first glance on sort of federal or state fisheries issues. You've got big industrial fishing interests, you've got small boat folks, you've got recreational, you've got conservation, tribal and indigenous communities that are trying to have more of a say and should have more of a say in the decision-making processes. We all might seem like we have really kind of different takes and are divided sometimes. But I genuinely think when it comes to putting long-term sustainability first, something that we've under Magnuson, we've shown that can work with when you have the rules in place and the systems in place. There aren't a lot of groups left that have those different perspectives. We're more about the small boat and the community-based fisheries than industrial at the network, but bringing as many voices as we can together on those issues and finding the alignment. I think it's incredibly valuable. I think decision makers in Washington and at the state and council level too, being able to hear from that kind of coalition is it's a rare, important perspective to hear. And then, there are some issues that I wasn't really tasked to work on coming onto NRDC. Like, we're a conservation group. We're focused on watchdog and conservation, but there are some issues like restoring working waterfront infrastructure and processing and workforce development that I've come to believe are conservation issues as well in their own way, because we really, I could talk more about some of our international facing work and all of the kind of crazy global dynamics that have impacted our industry. But if we want to sort of secure the future of fishing for the next 50 plus years, like, we need to invest in those working waterfronts and communities as well. And those are the voices that I think are really well positioned to be kind of strong advocates for conservation. And that's what the network's all about too. So I've enjoyed working more on that issue along with the core, the standard fare conservation stuff.
Yeah, and that it is exactly correct. And in terms of looking at a coalition group, if you play only to one segment of that, then the others, while they may be willing to participate, are really just going to listen and not contribute. But and you made a great point about the small commercial fishermen, right? And this is very apropos to my experience with the fly fishing industry, is that you want to encourage the good behavior. You want to encourage the good actors. And so if you say, we want you to be good actors, but you got to do it on your own, we're not going to help you with that. We're not going to use our resources to help you be successful, because it's not, but these things are more important. Well, that it didn't work in the fly fishing industry, and I don't think it would work well in this context. But looking and saying, okay, if we are going to have fishing in this country, and I want to get to the international because it relates to this, but if we're going to have a fishing industry in this country, and our fundamental law says it should be done with conservation in mind, because it's both good for the fish, and the resource, but it's good for the industry. And the way the law is designed is to sort of make that work well. We can talk about whether it's doing that, but that's where it's designed. And if we want to grow conservationists, we can't just say, hey, we're going to ignore your own needs. We just want you to do it this way. It's what I call the Wilfred Brimley approach. It's just the right thing to do. Well, that's fine. But, when you're going bankrupt, that's a very different burrito for you to deal with. So it is a great segue into the work I know that's occupying a lot of your time, and has been one of the more interesting educations for me, is the whole seafood trade issues. So I'm going to give you the platform. Tell fill people in on what's going on there, especially on the international trade stuff.
Yeah, no, and thank you. I think it really is center of mind to a lot of fishing communities right now, that they're sort of up against sort of cheap, unfair imports into the U.S. And it's something that our government is focusing on too. So I'm glad to be able to talk more about it at the network and figure out how it ties in. Going just if you'll allow me to like step back for a few minutes,
Absolutely.
I do think it's interesting. It's interesting to think about the big regime shifts that happened as a result of those successive amendments to the Magnuson Stevens Act. First sort of like reducing capacity in the fleets, making sure we were kind of being able to have a resource long term. That happened in a lot of ways with the rebuilding requirement, and then trying to add more science-based decision making and accountability into the process. Those were like some pretty big cornerstone changes for the fisheries, and a ton. And then of course there were catch shares too in a number of fisheries that had major regime shift implications. I think it's important to recognize the extent to which fishing communities did have to adapt and update and innovate, and that's sort of in their nature to do, but tons of work to respond to all of these new requirements in the act and to become what we consider now as sort of the gold standard for fisheries management and for conservation. And so it's not like we're perfect. I know we could talk about tweaks that we want to make to Magnuson going forward, and I think it's important to keep that vision in place, when it comes to minimizing ecological impacts of fishing and improving conditions for working waterfronts. There's a number of things we'd like to see happen, but we can no longer ignore the fact that the seafood trade is a global commodity. It's the highest, it's the most traded food commodity, right? Which is pretty wild considering it's also like a wild ecosystem that we're managing. Yeah. It's our last wild food source. And a big part of that I've been focused on for the last, actually since I came to NRDC, is that upwards of a third of global catch in global fisheries is a result of illegal, unreported, and unregulated, or IUU fishing. Kind of a not great acronym. Sometimes we shorten it as just illegal fishing, but there are sort of these distinct categories that are all important ways. And those are practices that, they evade the rules. They can have sort of an outsized impact on fish populations and on habitat because they're using illegal gear or fishing in marine protected areas where they shouldn't be fishing. They overlap with all other kinds of illegal practices that one might be trying to engage in when they're out on the high seas or elsewhere, kind of under, outside of the watchful eyes of governments. And they're also propped up by pretty horrific labor abuses that are like, forced labor, but also various forms of human trafficking that are kind of the business model in some global fisheries. And that it seems like a really depressing, like intractable issue. And especially when you think about these, the illicit nature of these, it's like, how can we even estimate how many boats are out there fishing illegally if we can't find them? But I think it becomes a little more, well, definitely more close to home, more relevant to our work here in US policy when you think about the fact that we import 90% of the seafood that Americans consume. We have a growing, and globally this is true as well, but in America there's growing demand for seafood. And we're meeting that demand with imports that has been, at the expense of market access for local fishing communities that once, maybe 20 years ago, I'll take the West Coast just as an example, like there was a market for Pacific rockfish, groundfish species to maybe not huge, but there were some processors on the West Coast that were sort of supporting those working waterfront businesses. There was a pipeline to be able to sell that catch. I think it was marketed as like a snapper at one point, which it can't be more because of labeling laws. But now I think those folks in the groundfish fishery that worked really hard to kind of respond to conservation standards, there's just a market access issue now. There's not a market for the catch. And that's true in a lot of different ways in different fisheries. the one you probably see on the news the most, but it's certainly not the only one, is the plight of the shrimp industry in the U.S. because Americans love shrimp, and we're importing so much of it, and it's very cheaply produced, largely farmed, lots of labor issues. So that's one that gets a lot of attention, but that competition is affecting Alaska fisheries, New England fisheries, and as a response to that, we think it's incumbent upon the U.S. and our policymakers in particular to make sure we're putting higher standards in place for what we import. It's not the only. There's a lot more to combating global illegal fishing, including more capacity building in countries, like in terms of putting. You mentioned boots on the ground. There's a lot of important work with the fisheries managers, with the fishing communities in country, and we actually have some pretty important task forces and agencies in the U.S. that support that work mostly through money, but as well as sort of expert capacity building. But it's important not to discount the fact that the kind of major market countries that import seafood. If you look at the EU, Japan, the US, and maybe a handful of others, that's about 75% of the seafood market. So if these countries can better align on what a high standard is for seafood imports and actually trying to block product that is at a high risk for IUU fishing or for labor issues, that's how we can cut off the financial incentive to cheat. And we've been pretty focused on that singular goal, working on other things as well. But the import controls is a big one for us for the last 10 years or so. And there are some tools that are in NOAA fisheries wheelhouse, so that overlaps a fair bit with Magnuson Stevens Act implementation. There are other agencies as well that are involved, and a number of proposals in Congress that we've had. I'm proud actually to have worked a few years ago on some improvements to enforcement provisions and funding for enforcement that made it all the way through the legislative process and made it into law. And this is a bipartisan issue, gets support from both Republicans and Democrats, that we want to level the playing field for our fishing communities. We want to sort of, it's considered a pretty high national security risk as well. So we want to sort of make sure we're tackling it appropriately. And then, we had some early wins through legislation on this issue, but there's a lot more to be done. So working on some new legislative proposals, one that we expect to be introduced soon in the House that would really get at this issue of how can we improve import controls, traceability, and transparency in seafood supply chains. And just one example of that is the seafood that the federal government procures. We should at least have standards in place to make sure that that's not a product of IUU or forced labor. And right now we don't. So, excited to see some new proposals come out soon. We've seen forward momentum on that issue, but there's a lot more that remains to be done. And I think it pairs nicely as a vision to work toward, setting these standards, setting the bar, pairing that with some of the network's own proposals for supporting working waterfronts and kind of bringing back some of that shoreline infrastructure for U.S. fisheries. I'm not saying we have all the answers figured out for those issues. They can be quite thorny, but working toward that sort of vision for leveling the playing field, I think, is great. And I hope it's something that the Trump administration, the White House, wants to move forward with. They have indicated in the Seafood Competitiveness Executive Order that they want to eliminate unfair imports and level the playing field. And I know it's a priority. So that's something we're kind of keenly focused on in the next couple of years.
Well, I mean, it's sort of like, how is IUU fishing conservation? Well, IUU fishing and illegal imports and bad labor practices are what create opportunities for people who don't care about resources to exploit them. Whereas if we can force the issue through advocacy, through legislation, through lawsuits, whatever, to elevate the standards that of the seafood, as you said, seafood is a growing market. And if we just say, well, you can't import that stuff anymore, and there's no capacity to replace it, we're going to shoot ourselves in the foot, frankly. And so I think, again, I look at I'm now a enthusiast on this issue because of the education you've given me over the last year on it. But again, I look at connecting those dots between economic activity and conservation outcomes, and I see now how this is a big piece of that puzzle. And if we, as the Marine Fish Conservation Network, want to promote conservation, then we have to address the things that prevent conservation from happening. Does that sound right?
I think that's right. And it's, it can seem sort of, well, I guess I use the word intractable. It can also seem like, oh gosh, like what use is the network? This kind of, it's an interesting cross section of representation, but it's a small U.S. based coalition. What can we do about this massive global issue? But I think fisheries they're so important to so many of us. Of course, there's billions of people still rely on seafood as their primary protein source. So just looking at like the future of fishing globally and the future of the U.S. seafood industry, of course, we want to have a position on that, and rooting out sort of the most harmful, illegal practices. That could be step one. A lot of the tools that we talk about for getting at those issues also help to kind of penetrate other governments' laws with your basic fisheries management and monitoring, control, and surveillance measures that we kind of similar to what we have in the U.S. Mm-hmm. So by working on rooting out those issues, you're sort of putting standards in place for fisheries management, and helping to kind of address the regulatory structure internationally too. So it's a kind of fascinating to think how it all fits together. But it's one of those issues, like so many in fisheries, where there's absolutely no silver bullet. I don't even think there's like 10 silver bullets. There's a lot of different policy solutions that have to work together. So I love that the network is kind of working on how its positions and proposals fit into that ecosystem.
It seems to me to be one of the typical evolutions within the network is that somebody brings forward a notion and we start kicking it around and discussing it. And the next thing you know, we're beginning to see how you pull on one thread and it is attached to the universe, right? So, well, let's.
That's for sure.
I'm cognizant of the time, and one of my closings was going to be talking about Ken Hinman, but you've done a masterful job of bringing that into the conversation.
I beat you to the chase. Yeah,
you did. You beat me to the punch on that one. And so I'm gonna end quickly then with sort of what gives you hope. We've got Magnuson out there. We've got an opportunity to grow the seafood industry. We've got the opportunity to do good conservation. What gives you hope?
Yeah, well, a few thoughts. It's hard to pick one. I think it's hard to be working in fisheries without being a bit of an optimist. And because it's nothing if not complicated, and these are long, wicked problems sometimes that need to be solved. But the first thought would be, since, in the 10 years since I've been at NRDC, we've both beaten back some pretty bad proposals to roll back the Magnuson Stevens Act, one being the Empty Oceans Act, if you recall, so-called Empty Oceans Act. And that was not a given, even in a Democratic-controlled Congress, right. Not even close to a given. That bill would not pass the House and then make it over to the Senate and end up really kind of eroding those core conservation requirements that we talked about. There's with every kind of 3 inches of progress, there is of course a movement to kind of bring it back and maybe inches backwards. So I think that's important that through the strength of coalitions, including ours, we've been able to really build long-term support for those conservation measures, show the importance of them. And it's been a while since we've seen any similar rollback proposals. And I hope, knock on wood, I hope it'll be a long time going forward, because I think we have some important momentum and champs in Congress for the next 50 years, right? Like, what do we need to do to build on our gains and respond to climate change and other challenges that are already well in front of us. And then I think if I'm thinking ahead, I do think it's good to keep that vision for Magnuson in place. I also think a lot of the next 10, 20, 50 years will be defined by how we sort of deal with this import issue, with the lack of sort of, how can we make sure U.S. fishing communities have market access and that there's sort of a fair, level playing field with the international fishing ecosystem. And that includes sort of the working waterfronts issue and support for small scale fishery. So like I said, I don't think we have all the answers, but I'm really looking forward to working more on that with the network and finding solutions going forward. And then I guess just on a personal note, personal anecdote, because it is all connected. I had a great moment, my first ocean fishing trip with my 6-year-old son last summer up in Maine.
Wonderful.
Yeah, and he was so excited, but he was nervous because he thought, like, should I practice? Like, I don't know how to use this type of gear. And I was like, I don't get to go out that much either. I'll be reminding myself how it all works. And we were in so Maine, so maybe you've been to this area, but in Mid-Coast Maine, there's an area called Merry Meeting Bay. We were off of the Kennebec River, but it's called Merry Meeting because it's 6 major rivers in Maine all meet here. And it's just, when it comes to anadromous fish, just like absolutely critical spawning habitat and ground for juvenile fish. Not to mention, it's just stunningly beautiful.
It is stunningly beautiful.
Yeah, it's just gorgeous. We were out there, and I knew it was August, so I knew we weren't going to be really getting a lot of stripers at that point, but I was thinking, like, oh, maybe there'll be some river herring, some shad, some mackerel. And it was just thick with mackerel coming back into the bay. And so he was able to catch, I don't know, like 20 sabiki line, like a bunch of different, and let them all go. Mackerel are so cool. And he was like, "Whoa, that was so easy." And it immediately I was like, if we had been here a few years ago, I don't think there would have been any mackerel. Stock was in terrible shape in 2017, and NOAA Fisheries put a rebuilding plan in place that we were actually advocating at the council at the time for a more aggressive rebuilding timeline. That's something that we do. We kind of come in and we're like, the law says as short as possible. It doesn't say like rebuild it when it's convenient. But they landed on, I think they landed on like a 5-year rebuilding timeframe for mackerel that they then had to like extend out a little bit due to some unforeseen circumstances. And it's still at the tail end of its rebuilding program. But last year there was a research track assessment that showed like historically good numbers and recruitment in the fishery. I think like the egg survey was the best since it had been in the 80s. So just to have that line up with that moment up in Maine, being awash with mackerel, and then knowing that that's also another, we didn't get to this, the forage fish issue, but knowing that pause on mackerel mortality is also having a big impact on allowing river herring and shad, some of which are really highly depleted fish populations in southern New England, giving them a chance to rebound as well from the bycatch in the mackerel fishery. It's just nice to see that when this mortality is like something that fishery managers can control. They don't always like to do it, but when they do, the fish come back. And it's like, it was just cool to be there at that moment.
It's like forests regenerating. It's remarkable how resilient nature is and how well it works when it's given an opportunity.
Yeah.
And I'm delighted your son got to see the fruits of your work right there.
Yeah. I mean, I certainly can't take credit, but that's, and also, it's crazy to think that you'd think like, oh yeah, box checked, like the fisheries rebuilt and we're going to be good. But it's just not a given, because as soon as the council gets an inch, they want to sort of double fishing mortality, step on the gas. And we're sort of always trying to be that, the brakes in those situations to make sure that
and that's
the rebuilding actually comes to fruition.
And that's another example of being a conservation watchdog
Yeah.
with a pen and policy, as opposed to a shovel and boots. Molly, thank you. It's been a delightful conversation. Could go on for hours. I always enjoy talking with you. I especially enjoy learning from you, and the IUU fishing thing has been a big eye opener for me, and I thoroughly enjoyed it. I'm going to thank you, and it's been both educational and enjoyable, and that's terrific. Is there anything else you'd like to share before we wrap up?
Oh gosh, I feel like I've definitely gone on. We could talk for hours, Tom. That is very true. But no, I mean, I want to thank you for your leadership and for keeping the Policy Council running and bringing all those great perspectives that we talked about, bring them together. That's part of what matters. We need folks like you to help us do that. So thank you. I'll picture you out fly fishing somewhere beautiful over the next couple of weeks, whilst picturing myself in the Kennebec up in Maine.
There you go. There you go. All right. Well, thank you, Molly. And that's it for us today. And our next Waterside Chat is in the works. We're going to have a double header. We're going to have two people on the chat together, Kevin Scribner and Erica Fuller. So look forward to that. And until next time, thanks for joining us.
If you enjoyed this episode of Waterside Chat, share it with your friends and colleagues. You can check us out on YouTube or most podcast services. To stay up to date on Waterside Chats and the Marine Fish Conservation Network, sign up for emails at conservefish.org. Thanks for listening, and we'll catch you at the next Waterside Chat.